Hey everybody, so I'm back with another one of these iPad assisted design videos. I'm going to be doing a little less drawing. I did all my drawing ahead of time this time, and we'll see how that plays out. So you can see the image in front of you is this Mugo pine that I bought from a nursery, I think a year or two ago. I can't remember. It was on sale. Some of the branching, this particular type of Mugo is sold as a dome, little green dome thing. Of course, we don't necessarily want exactly that in bonsai cultivation. And so I bought it, and it was one of the first trees that I started kind of messing around with. I removed some branches and some other stuff. I really have no idea just yet what I'm going to do with the branches. I'm going to wait and see what happens as the repotting process, getting it out of a nursery can and into a bonsai pot, which I'll be doing here this spring. I'm going to see how that goes before I make any other big decisions about the branching. But I do think, I kind of just took a picture here with it propped up to demonstrate. And so I'm just going to walk through the steps of the repotting and visualize them here on the iPad and see if that's a useful way of thinking about things. So the first step I took here, and I'll add this layer in, is kind of what I'm imagining. I don't know that this is the case, but what I'm imagining some of the root structure may look like within the pot. And so what you might notice here is that some of the roots here are crossing. So like here, for instance, this, oops, hold on, get on that layer. Here, for instance, this root is crossing here. If we also look, this root's coming and crossing here. This one's crossing here. All things that we might expect in a nursery can as things develop and grow out. What we want to do is want to try to correct for that. So in terms of the actual process, it will be pulling this whole thing up out of the nursery can, removing all the soil off the roots and seeing what the structure looks like. That's ultimately what the process will look like, but obviously I can't do that right now because I'm not ready to repot. So instead, I'm trying to visualize it on the iPad and talk it through with you all and see what you think. The next step will be to get those roots arranged and organized and cleaned up a little bit in a way that might look something like this. So the things that I would, I'm kind of noticing here is I'm still maintaining the general kind of, let's go to that layer. The general root flare here is still being maintained, which is good. There's some separation here between these roots, and they're going out more in a radial pattern, which is good. And we've also retained some of the fibrous roots, these little skinny guys here. They're the ones that we ultimately want to cultivate as much as possible. We want those structural roots visible on the surface of the bonsai pot, but we don't necessarily, other than that, we want small, fine roots because they're conducting a lot of resources in that tiny little space, and they'll allow us to get the less big, woody structural roots, the less length we have on those things, the better odds we have of getting this into a smaller and smaller container. And you'll hear sometimes people will talk about, so this is the nursery pot that it's in right now. You'll hear about getting it into a training pot, a training bonsai pot, which usually means, or it means that it's larger than what you would typically use for any sort of visual aesthetic purpose, but it's heading it in that direction. It's getting the tree trained, gives it a little more room, not as much constriction. Part of that has to do with the fact that you're not able to cut back the big chunky structural roots as aggressively in that first repotting as you might like to, because you want to keep some of those water conducting fine roots involved in the situation. So you'll then hear people talk. So this is just a terminology thing. Training pot. Then typically you'll sometimes hear people talk about moving it then into a show pot. The show pot in an ideal world is the smallest pot that tree can go into and maintain its horticultural health. It could be that going into a show pot is just a 1 year or 2 year thing that you're putting in the show pot because you know that you're having a show this year. And then after that, it's going to go back into a training pot and live in there for a couple of years. There's so much transience and impermanence in the bonsai world, including the pots that the trees are in. So that's just something to be aware of. But in general, we're going to move this probably into a bigger size bonsai pot first, which is a training pot. let it grow for a year, 2 years, 3 years in that pot, develop its roots, make sure everything's cool, maybe do some styling during that process, and then maybe think about moving it into a smaller container. Another thing I was just confused about when I first started looking into stuff is that training pots can be made of plastic or mica or can be inexpensive, but there are also training pots that are made of good ceramic, and they're made by decent production systems, and sometimes even artists will make larger training pots, or you can use a show pot that is larger as a training pot if that's something that you're interested in. So really, your budget and your approach will determine whether or not you use any of those along that spectrum. But for me, the word training pot doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a lower quality pot. It could. And if you're not showing it to anybody, then I guess you might want to use a cheaper pot. But it just means to me the size of it is larger than what we would ultimately like the tree to end up in, if that makes sense. Okay, so we've got the roots kind of transition them from being an all crossing tangled mess into something a little more radial. So now let's go ahead and get rid of, in the drawing here, let's get rid of the pot and bring in, or get rid of the development pot and bring in this bonsai pot. This is, I would say, a pretty large container relative to the proportions of the tree. So something very appropriate for training purposes, for getting this thing into its first bonsai pot. We're then going to take and we're going to add in multiple layers, and we'll cover this during repotting season, some soil, some media, as I would call it, but in the bonsai world called soil. This pot will probably end up being in a mix of, this tree will end up being in a mix of akadama, pumice, and lava for its the duration. Probably a 1-to-1-to-1 mix, if I were guessing. So we'll take and we'll fill that up, and you can see how the particles here are suspended throughout the container in front of, around the root mass. It's all that. So this is the time where you might hear about people doing chopsticking. And so from this view, let me get a different color here. Let's get something kind of a darker brown. So the chopstick is going to be used in contexts like, get onto this layer. It'll be used in contexts like this with a downward motion like this to push soil particles in these spaces in between the roots. And also, if there was an air gap here, for instance, the chopstick can be used to push that down into that space. So this is just that general process of chopsticking. And the goal is to have good contact between the roots and the media particles, the soil particles. The reason for that is that I've heard people say that roots don't grow into air gaps or into empty space. It's the trees have developed in a way that they're usually growing into soil, and so as they are very fine and they insert themselves into the soil, they're jamming in between the soil particles. In other words, they're used to a lot of soil contact in their developmental process. We are taking this thing out into the air, putting it back into the pot in air, and then taking and moving soil particles in. And so the least we can do is to try and simulate some degree of that soil contact so that the water and nutrients that are trapped in and on the soil surface, the soil particle surface, the media particle surface, can be transferred in by those roots across, osmotically into the tree. So that's why we're chopsticking. That's why we're packing in the soil content around the root masses, just because that's how trees like it. And we like trees to be happy, because happy trees are healthy trees and they respond to what we're trying to do in bonsai. And so just to give you a sense, let's see here, what do? I added a top here. That's about, the height where the pot's going to be. And then I just colored it in a little bit crudely to give you a sense of what the final product of all of that work might just be. And so if we jump back to the very beginning and we turn all these off. Oops, not that one. When we jump from here, that's our original process. This is it in the nursery can. And then we're going to just turn on a couple of layers here to give a sense of what that final product might look like. And so you can see the smaller pot does definitely give the tree a better sense of proportion. And so just to give you an idea of what it might look like to put it into a more of a show pot, could very well be the same or a similar size, but we could, oops, cancel, I'm on the wrong layer here. We could easily, shrink this proportions of this pot down to here, something like this, and maybe even a little bit shallower, something like this. And now, relative to that pot, the tree looks huge, right? It's almost impossible how large of a tree that is going into that pot. That might be a little bit extreme, but it does give you an idea of the type of thing, that the difference between a show pot and a training pot, just a little bit of size difference. The training pot is for visual effect most of all, and so it does have a constraining factor and it plays a part, but it's a lot about the aesthetics, and that's a big reason why we're doing bonsais, for the aesthetics. So one thing I could imagine, for what it's worth, I could imagine the potting angle of this tree changing over time. I think this might be how I do it here, but this is very very vertical and straight. And so depending on what is revealed as I take the nursery can away, I could imagine the potting angle changing to, something more like this. And so if we were going to get rid of all this here and maybe replace it with a pot that's more like this angle, something like that. And then just extend this visually down here. You could see the different visual effect that has, with a little bit more of a directional lean, this way, as opposed to the way it was before. But that is something that can be adjusted over time. So you could very well have this be the target end goal, but have it start out, in this type of a position. You could also see it going the other way. Could be maybe like this. I think this is probably the angle of inclination that we might look to. But anyway, hope that's a helpful explanation and overview of what the general visualization of what the repotting process looks like. If it is helpful, please give the video a like and subscribe. It's helpful for me because it gives me some feedback to let me know if there's something that was helpful here. Let me know in the comments, or if you have a different idea, let me know in the comments. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and I'll see you in the next video.